A documentary that highlighted Chris Brown's legal troubles over the years is facing legal trouble of its own after the singer filed a $500 million lawsuit accusing Warner Brothers Discovery and several others who worked on its production of libel and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The documentary premiered in October, and it was made from the same producers who brought the viewers the jaw-dropping docuseries Quiet on Set. In the Chris Brown documentary, though, the film packed together years of allegations of physical assault, alleged sexual assault, lawsuits, public meltdowns like trashing the green room at Good Morning America, throwing a brick at his mom's car, the restraining order taken out by his ex-girlfriend Karrueche Tran, and the 2009 brutal assault of his then-girlfriend Rihanna. Now, Chris Brown denies many of the allegations made against him, and he's never been found guilty of any sex-related crime. But the singer's attorney argued the documentary states in every available fashion that he's a serial rapist and sexual abuser. His lawyers argue those behind the documentary laid out a false narrative for a money grab. But it's not just the producers who are named in the suit. Brown is also going after one of his accusers. While his lawyers have publicly named her, we'll continue to refer to her as Jane Doe. Now, Jane Doe made an appearance in the film, but she appeared in a silhouette and her voice was altered. The woman claims she met Chris Brown while on a trip to Miami. She said a mutual acquaintance invited her to a party on Sean Diddy Combs' yacht. And before we get into the details, no, Diddy isn't accused of wrongdoing in this case. Doe said at the time she had recently moved to LA and was pursuing dancing when she saw Brown at the party and hoped it was a sign he could guide her or give her some advice. She said the two talked and he handed her a drink, but said that's when her memory got weird. The woman said she didn't remember if she saw Brown pour the drink, but she just drank it and he gave her another. And then she began to feel tired and her body started feeling heavy. She claimed Brown later took her to one of the yacht's bedrooms and allegedly raped her. She says after the alleged incident, she admitted she continued to speak to the singer. And while at first she says she didn't recognize the alleged incident as a sexual assault, she went to therapy where she could later admit to herself that it was a rape. Now, this alleged incident, she says, took place in 2020. 2 years later, in 2022, she filed a $20 million lawsuit against Brown. But here's the thing. Doe's case was ultimately dismissed, and her lawyer dropped her as a client after police uncovered text messages between Doe and Chris Brown, where Doe called Chris Brown babe and asked to see him again after the night of the alleged incident. She also allegedly texted Chris Brown months later saying, "missing you," and continued to text him for months after the alleged incident. Doe admitted to texting him in the months after in the documentary, but again, a judge tossed out the suit citing lack of prosecution. And her attorney, Ariel Mitchell-Kidd, who also represents alleged victims of Sean Diddy Combs, said back in October she's representing Jane Doe again, despite dropping her as a client in 2022. She told People, quote, "I adore my client and I believe what happened to her is 100% true. I feel that I failed her as an attorney because I couldn't make her comfortable enough with me in such a short period of time where she felt 100% comfortable being forthcoming with me." The storytelling Jane Doe had not only been discredited over and over, but was in fact a perpetrator of intimate partner violence and aggressor herself. That intimate partner violence, according to Brown's attorneys, comes from allegations Jane Doe harassed her ex-boyfriend online and threatened him with a knife. They continue to argue her history of violence and erratic behavior should have raised red flags for any responsible journalist. In a press release that was previously attached to Chris Brown's Instagram page, his attorney said in a statement, "This case is about protecting the truth. Despite being provided with evidence disproving their claims, the producers of this documentary intentionally promoted false and defamatory information, knowingly disregarding their ethical obligations as journalists. Their actions undermine not only Mr. Brown's decade-long efforts to rebuild his life, but also the credibility of true survivors of violence." While Chris Brown is seeking $500 million in his lawsuit, a portion of the money, according to his lawyer, will be donated to survivors of sexual abuse. I'm joined now by a great guest who's here in studio with me today, and that's litigator Rich Schoenstein. Rich, always great to see you. You know, $500 million, that number stands out a lot. What's your reaction to this Chris Brown lawsuit?
Well, it's an interesting figure. So the first thing I thought of reading the lawsuit is exactly that, damages, because this is somebody who has been reported on for years and involved with lots of other litigation. And the public has a view and opinion about him, I think. So let's assume this was a false story. Let's assume his allegations are correct for a minute, that this was a false story, that the defendants didn't investigate it, that they put it on. Has it really injured him? Has it injured him $500 million? Is there $500 million he would have received but for this sole story when in fact There have been incidents with other people that have already been reported on. I do note he says in this complaint that a portion of the $500 million he wants is going to be donated to charity, which is an interesting thing to say. He says, for total damages in the amount of $500 million, a portion of which will be donated to survivors of sexual abuse.
Yeah, it's very interesting that that portion was added to the lawsuit, as well as the kind of the press release. What's your reaction to that? Him being, forthcoming and wanting to, I guess, kind of clear his name in a way, but also kind of make this point out to the public that I do, respect survivors of sexual abuse. Here's, money if I do win this lawsuit.
Right. So that statement in his complaint has no legal significance. They can't award him punitive damages for him to give away to even a most worthy cause. That's not the way the legal system works. They will, someone will determine if he's liable, then they will assess compensatory damages, and if the judge thinks the case merits a punitive damage charge, the jury can consider that. It would never be anywhere near $500 million, and the jury wouldn't be able to consider his suggestion that he's going to give some of it to charity. It's completely meaningless. All of that exists only for the public-facing part of this, which, all of these kind of complaints are in part a document filed in the litigation, but in larger part, they're a PR statement, and that's part of his PR statement.
Yeah, because it seems like throughout this lawsuit, from the reports we've been reading as well, too, it doesn't appear that the lawsuit's not necessarily targeting what was in the documentary as far as the history of it, right? It really kind of boils down to that 2020 alleged incident that happened on Diddy's boat, where this Jane Doe accused him of drugging and raping her. Now, we know there's a lot of kind of back and forth with that. The lawsuit was dismissed, and it seems like that was kind of another point made in the lawsuit again for Chris Brown to file that, the documentary was portraying him to be the serial rapist, the serial sexual abuser. So what's kind of your reaction to Chris Brown's attorney's claims and how that all kind of, goes into the documentary as well, when you have this whole legal history of, Chris Brown getting in trouble?
Yeah, so when you file a defamation action, to prevail on a defamation action, the first thing you have to prove is that it's false. So you have to go to court with evidence to convince the jury that what was said about you is in fact false. So he's going to have to disprove those allegations, which is hard. That's a reason a lot of people don't file defamation suits, because they don't want to take on the burden of proving that it's false, and sometimes because they don't want to bring even more attention to the story. He, by filing this lawsuit, has brought even more attention to the documentary. We call it the Streisand effect. If you remember, there was a famous instance where Barbara Streisand brought a lawsuit because people kept taking photos of her home, and it only compelled the further dissemination and interest in those photos. And so when you magnify the allegations by instituting litigation, we sometimes call it the Streisand effect. So that is part of what's happening here, is he's making it a story again.
Yeah, and it seems throughout the years as well, too, a lot of allegations have been made against Chris Brown, and Chris Brown has responded on social media. But I'm wondering, is this lawsuit his final kind of look, I understand that I've had this history, we can point it back to Karrueche Tran, we can point it back to Rihanna, we can point it back, to other instances. But even when it comes to kind of the sexual assault allegations, he has been very forthcoming or vocal, I should say, about voicing his denial of these allegations made against him. So in terms of kind of filing a suit like this, how much of it, again, is PR versus, I really want to take this to court, I want to use the legal system to kind of get back what I deserve? How much of it is that versus just PR?
So we don't know the answer to that really good question until we see how it plays out. We've seen defamation suits that have been carried all the way to trial by people who really wanted to clear their name. Johnny Depp comes to mind. That's somebody who filed a suit, saw it all the way through trial, got a jury verdict in his favor, didn't really walk away with very much money at all, settled for a very small amount, but got public vindication. Other times we've seen defamation suits that are dropped, that are settled for an undisclosed or sometimes a disclosed monetary payment, and those are just cash grabs. My guess is that this particular lawsuit is more about trying to make a name-clearing PR effort than it is about actually recovering money, but only time will tell.
And, just to kind of give the filmmakers and the producers their side of this, I watched the documentary. And after the allegations were made, you're going to commercial break, the black screen comes out, Chris Brown denies all allegations, he's never been charged criminally in this matter, that type of thing. As far as the responsibility on documentarians, on filmmakers, do they carry that same responsibility that journalists do? Or is it one and the same in terms of ethics? Because to me, watching it, I felt like they did do their part. They reached out to Chris Brown's team, according to them, said that he denied the allegations, again, hasn't been charged criminally when it comes to these sexual abuse claims. But in terms of just ethics, does that have a leg to stand on in this lawsuit?
Well, I don't know. I'm not an expert in the ethics component of it, either for someone who makes documentaries or for journalists, for that matter. As a legal matter, if they are quoting allegations of others, then what they're reporting is truthful. These are the allegations that are made against him by this woman. And then they add to it, by the way, we reached out to Chris Brown. He denies everything, but didn't want to appear in our documentary. That's also truthful. If that's the full scope, and I haven't seen this documentary, so you're one up on me. But if that's the full effect of the documentary, then they ought to be okay, because they're entitled to report a story. They're entitled to report somebody's allegations. I think what he says in this lawsuit is it should have been obvious that that wasn't truthful, that the person who was making the allegations had issues that should have been red flags, that there wasn't enough investigation done, and that they shouldn't have put the thing on the air without being able to further verify it. That potentially is a reasonable claim, depending on what actually happened.
Yeah. And another question to you is, the documentary came out in late October. I'm sure beforehand, even when the production was kind of going on, I'm sure producers reached out to Chris Brown's team. And so, we go from October to now January when this lawsuit is filed. Why do you think he took until January, until this year, this month, to file that lawsuit? Is it that just a normal time frame for this type of lawsuit at this magnitude, or what are your thoughts?
No, I mean, so this is not, I'm looking at a 6-page complaint, right? I guess it's maybe a little longer than that, but this is not the hardest thing to put together. It shouldn't have taken 3 months to put together. So either it could be a bunch of different things. Maybe they had discussions with the defendants. Maybe there were settlement efforts. I don't know. Maybe they had to decide whether or not they were going to pursue the litigation. Maybe first they demanded a retraction, or maybe they just didn't make up their mind, or maybe once they made up their mind, they didn't want to do it during the holidays because the news cycle kind of swallows things during the holidays, or maybe because Baldani and Lively are commanding the airwaves, they wanted to wait until that was over, until there was a calm moment, and then strategically put it out so it would be a news story. I have no idea how many of those factors went into play or how they came up with the timing.
Yeah, it seems like a lot kind of going on there. And again, that $500 million just really sticks out to you, and I'm sure sticks out to a lot of people. The producers who made this documentary were the same ones who also made the Quiet on Set documentary. That documentary was jaw-dropping, as we all know, kind of going into the allegations made on Nickelodeon sets, all of that sort. So in terms of filmmakers, documentarians, again, kind of making these types of stories, but then, people who are the subject of it, in that case with Quiet on Set, it was Dan Schneider. In this case, now we have Chris Brown. But in terms of the liability that they potentially face, is it enough to just say they aren't accused of wrongdoing, they denied the claims? Is it enough when they're filming this type of content, which can be kind of hard to kind of delve into all these different pieces, but kind of what does it say to filmmakers when, these types of things happen where the subject of a documentary ends up slapping them with a defamation suit.
Well, hopefully anybody who's putting out this kind of content has someone doing a pre-screening to try to flag if there are any issues, because the statements that are made have to be reviewed both specifically. Are these statements all either true or attributable to a source? But also holistically, as a whole, does this portray accurately the situation, or does it cast it in a misleading light? And everything like this, especially when you get big companies like Warner Brothers involved, there's no way this wasn't pre-screened by somebody who thought to themselves, are we creating a defamation lawsuit by putting this? And remember, one other point I will make, if you will permit me.
Of course.
We're seeing now, I've been talking for several years about the acceleration of defamation lawsuits in the United States, because we've seen plenty of them. And lately, we're seeing defamation suits against news organizations, filmmakers. We had the Trump suit against the ABC network that was settled. One of the lawsuits that's come out of the Baldoni-Lively situation is a lawsuit against the New York Times. CNN was just on trial, just lost a big trial last week and had to settle the punitive damages portion of it. So we're seeing sort of a spate of lawsuits against media. And I think media in the current environment has to be extra cautious, because people are suspicious of the information that's being put out. They're challenging it in court. And at least in some cases, juries are taking the side of the plaintiffs.
Yeah, and for our viewers out there, if you're wondering why we always say alleged victims in these cases, that kind of answers their question. Do you see a point where this even gets litigated? Do you think it'll even go that far?
It could. So again, I don't know the inner workings here. I mean, you have Warner Brothers, which is the big, deep pocket defendant, and then you have these other people. You have the accuser and some of the other filmmakers that are involved as defendants. But really the question of whether it could be settled with, for example, a large check is going to rest in the hands of Warner Brothers. And presumably they have lawyers who are looking at this carefully and saying how much it will cost to litigate and what their chances are and what they could lose if they lost. And all that's going to be taken into consideration. And at some point there will be discussions about settling it. It could be settled for money. It could be settled for money and an apology. It could be settled for money and an apology and a new version of the documentary. There are a lot of ways you could resolve it. It's always possible that the plaintiff wants to go to trial. That is always a possibility. It seems to me in this situation like this plaintiff would be bringing a lot of baggage into court. A lot of baggage into court to get cross-examined on. I have a little bit of a hard time imagining this case actually going to trial.
Yeah, and I guess we'll see how this all continues to play out. Rich, I want to thank you so much for your insight into this. Before we sign you off, though, where do you think all of this goes from here?
Well, I mean, it goes in, litigation is a long process, right? Cases like this take years to resolve. So the next stage is there'll be a response to the complaint. Defendants may move to dismiss it or parts of it. Or they may answer it. Then in theory, the case goes into discovery. So we're not going to see all of that. We'll see what's filed in court. We won't see all of the inner workings of the case, but it'll be interesting to see where it goes.
Well, that's for sure. Rich, again, thank you so much for your time today. I always appreciate seeing you.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course.
A spokesperson for Investigation Discovery said in a statement, "We stand behind the production and will vigorously defend ourselves against this lawsuit." Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.